just bummed because no one knows what occupational therapy is. Hashtag, can you find me a job? Hashtag, can you take a look at my resume? Hashtag, my family thinks I'm a PT.
I totally know what you mean. It's so frustrating. I get that all the time. Hashtag, so OT's only with the arm. Hashtag, so OT's like PT. Hashtag, my grandma had PT once. Hashtag, the population needs a max assist on OT education.
What we do is so simple. Hashtag, we do what people want and need. Hashtag, we do what's important to them. Hashtag, I want to see you get dressed. Hashtag, you gotta put pants on at some point. Hashtag, wash your face. Hashtag, don't forget that left side.
Yeah, we really do it all. Hashtag, let me assess that vision and balance. Hashtag, I want to see you make a sandwich. Hashtag, I don't think the lettuce goes there. Hashtag, let me assess that cognition.
Yeah, we work with the whole person, physical and mental health. Hashtag, gotta write my soap note. Hashtag, has nothing to do with soap. Hashtag, unless we did a grooming activity. Hashtag, I want to see you get out of bed.
I really like to help clinically reason to help my patients give them the best care and help them do their day-to-day activities. Hashtag, you came to me at a max assist. Hashtag, you're leaving at a modified independent. Hashtag, you just been OT'd.
I know exactly what you mean. One time a patient came to me and he was like, hashtag, I see a little silhouette of a man. So I was able to do a hashtag vision assessment and realized he had hashtag macular degeneration. So we did a hashtag home assessment and now he can move about his home, hashtag safely. Hashtag safety first, hashtag safety last, hashtag safety everything in between.
Well, I think we've given a lot of good examples about OTs too. Hashtags vision assessment, hashtag cognition, hashtag home evaluation, hashtag safety, hashtag physical movement, hashtag therapy for the everyday life. So let's go to some of our OT classmates and see if they can give us any more examples of what occupational therapists do. Hashtag the OT life, hashtag the OT struggle.
Hashtag it's getting hot in here. Hashtag
faulty hypothalamus.
Hashtag so learn to doff your clothes.
Hashtag you've fallen and you can't get up with OT.
Hashtag sleep. Hashtag ADLs.
Hashtag is OT like PT?
Hashtag what? Hashtag no.
Hashtag ain't nothing but a G code, baby.
Hashtag transfers.
Hashtag feeding. Hashtag nom 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 nom.
Hashtag AOTA Centennial Vision 2017. Hashtag roadmap to our future.
Hashtag bro tea. Hashtag pants.
Hashtag TheraBand.
Hashtag geriatrics.
Hashtag living life to its fullest. Hashtag empowerment.
Hashtag, are you gonna find me a job? Hashtag, my patients have no idea what I do.
Hashtag moho ho 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 ho.
Hashtag orthoses.
Hashtag fieldwork. Hashtag clinical education. Hashtag experiential education. Hashtag take our students.
Hashtag can you draw me a clock? Hashtag left neglect.
Hashtag wheelchair mobility.
Hashtag caring for others.
Hashtag money management.
Hashtag showering. Hashtag can I have sex?
Hashtag proper positioning.
Ho 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 ho.
Hashtag adaptive equipment.
Hashtag toileting.
Hashtag creative occupations.
Hashtag grooming. Hashtag ideational apraxia.
Hashtag my family has no idea what I do for a living. Hashtag the struggle is real.
Hashtag mental health. Hashtag psychosocial issues.
Hashtag do you know where your arm is?
Hashtag proprioception.
Hashtag, so my teachers want me to learn all about hashtag Medicare, but hashtag Medicant.
Hashtag pediatrics. Hashtag top-down assessment. Hashtag duh, function first.
Hashtag reacher.
Hashtag range of motion. Hashtag manual muscle test.
Hashtag what's a gummy?
Hashtag leisure activities. Hashtag do you help me find a job?
Hashtag medication management.
Hashtag myofascial relief.
Hashtag vasomotor response.
Hashtag PNF.
Hashtag diagonals.
Hashtag advocacy for occupational therapy.
Hashtag OT